Today we're going to be installing the FuelMAX by JMS. What this essentially is a fuel pump booster. So what this does is it actually overdrives the fuel pump by amplifying the voltage, thereby overdriving the pump and then having it produce more fuel. I've seen claims up to 85%, probably depending on application, but if I can even get 30% out of this pump, that should be able to get me back into a safe zone when it comes to my carbureted application. Anyone that knows carburetors knows that carburetors actually use up a ton of fuel flow. And the reason for that is because the regulators are designed to bypass the majority of the fuel in order to keep the pressures down. So by overdriving the pump with this FuelMAX, you should be able to get those pressures constant, but the fuel flow will still increase. So this isn't actually supposed to have you run it full time. You're supposed to only activate it when you need it. The way I'm going to have it set up today is I'm going to run it off of a Hobbs switch. When it sees 3 psi of pressure, it's going to activate the FuelMAX, and the FuelMAX is going to start overdriving the pump at whatever voltage I set it to. A lot of people seem to think that you don't need these types of system on your vehicle, just go ahead and upgrade the pump. So a lot of times there's a huge step between the pump you have and the pump you don't need, but you need a pump that's in between. You need a little bit of extra volume to get your tune back where it needs to be. So there are a few different versions of the FuelMAX. I actually have the universal FuelMAX, which is the P2000 and the P2020. Both of those are universal fuel pumps. The only difference is that the P2000 is a single pump, but you could also get pumps that are factory installations on Camaros, Mustangs, etc. So I'm actually going to be jumping around in the instructions because according to step 5, that's when you mount the unit. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mount the unit under my bench seat. And I'm sure in a car you could follow these directions and it would be fine, but on a truck like this where the fuel tank is too far away from the unit and I'm going to need to splice and add to these wires, it doesn't matter where the box is located as long as it's accessible. I could always move it under the dash if I wanted to, but I want to be messing with it when I get on the dyno, so right by my feet's a good idea. Also, you want to keep it away from direct contact with water and extreme heat because that's going to damage the unit as well. It is a computer after all, so under the driver's seat is going to be perfectly fine for me. So the kit actually comes with sheet metal screws, but since my truck is mainly an off-road rig, I don't really trust sheet metal screws to keep things in place. So what I did is I actually drilled out the holes and ran bolts with lock nuts and washers, and that should secure this FuelMAX in place. The last thing you want is for this thing to be bouncing around and destroying itself on the road. The next order of business is to actually run these wires outside of the cab and toward their designated locations. 2 of these need to run to the battery, some of these need to run to ground, and some of them need to run to the fuel pump. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how I'm going to run them through this truck. So I just finished running this harness. I have it running behind the bench seat, right here through the floorboards, into this hole in the firewall, and then you come around and it comes out of this hole that's right here under my heater hoses. Then it comes across this way behind my clutch line, runs behind the engine. It's actually right here, I'm holding it, and then it cuts across. They gave us enough wire to run this Hobbs switch all the way to my wastegate, all the way to my fuel pressure regulator if I wanted to. This is insane. This is a lot of wire. I'm going to have to trim this back, but I'm actually happier that they gave us too much than not enough on this part. All right, so we're getting to the wiring portion of this, which is everybody's favorite part. And the way they have it set up, it's kind of convoluted and has way too many things going on. So instead of trying to explain to you what the page says, I decided to redraw it like I normally do. And hopefully you guys will be able to understand this a little bit better. So the system that we're looking at right now, it's the stock system. This is your battery. You have the negative cable going to chassis ground. You have the positive cable. That goes out and feeds 2 fuses. One of those fuses feeds your ignition switch. Your ignition switch then turns on, energizes the fuel pump relay. The fuel pump relay, after it energizes, it goes straight to ground. Then you have the second circuit. Right below it, you get battery voltage just like before. You go into a fuse. This one's actually going to be the fuel pump fuse itself. That is then going to feed the hot side of the fuel pump relay. When the relay is energized, the switch closes. Once that switch closes, it actually feeds your fuel pump, and then you get fuel pressure. This is typical for most stock cars and some aftermarket vehicles. Now let's go ahead and redraw this system, but introducing the FuelMAX. All right, so I've redrawn the whole system, but this time I'm actually incorporating the FuelMAX. So we're going to start off with what we know. So we have the negative side of the battery and the positive side of the battery, just like we had before. We have the wire going to the fuse that goes to the ignition switch, which we had before. So that's all the same. We have the ignition switch that energizes the relay. Then we have the ground side of the relay on the opposite side right there. If we come back down, we go to the fuse just like we had in the other one, but this time we're going to go ahead and upgrade that fuse per the instructions to 30 amps. And the reason we're going to do that according to the instructions is that the FuelMAX pulls more amps out of the system. So if you don't upgrade the fuse, you're going to be popping it as soon as the FuelMAX activates. Once you upgrade that fuse, you're going to keep going. It's going to power the hot side of the relay just like we did before. Once the relay is energized, the circuit is going to close and it's going to feed the red side of the FuelMAX. On the FuelMAX, there's a fat red wire that has a 40 amp fuse. That's the wire you're going to be hooking up to your relay. And then you have the white wire coming out of the FuelMAX. That's going to continue on into your fuel pump with the increased voltage. Now, I know what you're going to ask, why do we have two fuses? And the short answer is I'm not sure, but I'm sure it's a safety thing. To actually activate the voltage boosting, you have two options. You have a hop switch and then you have a 5-volt input switch. We're going to go ahead and look at the hop switch first because that's what I'm going to be using. So the hop switch is a switch that looks like this. All this does is it actually uses manifold pressure or boost pressure to close the circuit that's inside of this, and then it will connect these two contacts together. The sub harness that came with the FuelMAX came with the two connectors for the hop switch. It came with a gray wire and a black wire. One goes here, one goes there. Once you have those two hooked up, you can hook up the bottom to a boost line, and then this thing should activate at a preset boost value. According to the back here, it is set up to activate at 5 psi. I know there's like a little nut up here that you can adjust to bring that pressure up, but 5 psi is more than enough. So once this sees a boost pressure increase of over 5 psi, it's going to kick on the FuelMAX and you should be good to go. The second option is to take the red wire that comes out of the sub harness and hook it up to a 5-volt input. That could be a map sensor, that could be a TPS, or if you have an ignition module that has an output, you can wire it up to an output there. So that way when the box sees a certain manifold vacuum or when it sees a certain RPM, it can send a 5-volt signal out to whatever I want. Because this runs on a 5-volt input, let's say I set up the ignition box to kick on the output at 3,500 RPM. So anything above 3,500 RPMs, it's going to get this 5-volt output. That 5-volt output would then activate the FuelMAX and then boost the power coming out of the white wire into the fuel pump. You're not supposed to hook up both the hop switch and the 5-volt input. You either use one or you use the other, but you should not use both. So figure out which one's better for your application and go from there. The FuelMAX has an adjustment on the back, just like on the hop switch. It won't kick on until after 5 psi. You can set up the FuelMAX red wire that it won't overdrive the pump until it reaches a certain amount of voltage on the input side. So when it's idling, it won't try to overdrive the pump. Like I said, the easiest option for me is going to be the hop switch, so I'm going to go ahead and install that. Alright, so we are jumping to the physical wiring portion of this video. So as you guys can see, I have the two red wires, two white wires, and the black wire. I mentioned earlier that this is the dual pump setup, which means it actually has two red wires. So figure the system that we talked earlier and just multiply it by 2. Originally with the systems for like new installations where you're setting up a dedicated relay for this box and for each individual circuit, which is probably why the box has its integrated protection. But since we're only running a single pump, and since we're also running the FuelMAX in its regular configuration right now, I'm going to tie into only one of the red wires and the other one I'm going to cap off. One thing I didn't realize is that this system is set up as a parallel wired system, but at the same time, it's all tied in together. So if you feed one red wire, you're feeding both white wires. And if you're feeding one red wire, you're actually feeding both red wires. So it doesn't really matter which one of these white wires goes to your fuel pump, and it doesn't really matter which one of these red ones go to the white wires. So I picked one of the red wires and ran it behind the bench seat, and now the other one I just have it tucked away in this corner. These two white wires, I have one of them just tied up in the corner, and the other one I have it running to the pump. So let's go ahead and look at the red wire first. So like I said, I have the red wire going behind the bench seat, tying into the stock harness that I have in my truck. Then I went in and I clipped out what I thought was the fuel pump wire. Turns out this was the wire for my 7-pin connector for my trailer. So now I have to do a little bit of repair on this other wire that I clipped, but for now I have this red wire coming out of my harness, and that will feed the low power side of the FuelMAX whenever my ignition key is turned on. Like I mentioned earlier, if you don't trigger the FuelMAX with the 5-volt input or the Hobbs switch, the FuelMAX is going to default. I have the white wire running through my frame and then goes up, and then it goes into this toolbox because that's where my fuel tank is. And then I clipped the stock harness that goes to this fuel tank, and I found the primary pump wire that I'm supposed to be using. I actually ran out of white wire and I extended the wires with this black wire, but color wire doesn't matter as long as you know what you're using. And then I have a butt connector to a butt connector, which you really shouldn't do, but I didn't really want to lose that color for when I rewire everything that's inside this toolbox. So the fuel pump is hooked up and my fuel sending unit is still operational because I haven't touched any of those wires. And now we just have to make sure that the fuel pump is still working. So as you guys can see, the system is still operating just as good as it did before. So there's no harm, no foul in the installation. The only thing left to check now is to see what gains we're going to get when we get back on the dyno in a couple of days. Since the only way to trigger this system is to go under boost, I won't be able to actually see what the improvements are until I'm able to max out the stock fuel pump on the dyno and then activate the FuelMAX and see how much further we can take the stock pump. So that's in a future video. Once I have it, I'll link it down in the description below. I will see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.